When man fights the elements, it's never an equal struggle. Man's most enduring struggle is his bid to tame the sea. And, as in all such battles, the innocent suffer. On March the 18th, 1967, the 120,000-ton tanker, the Torrey Canyon, forced to alter its course to avoid some fishing boats, ran aground off the coast of the Scilly Isles. The headlines called it the greatest peacetime threat to Britain. Most shocking were the lethal effects oil could wreak on helpless wildlife.
It wasn't the first time a tanker had run aground, but what it was identifiably the first super spill. This was the first really large tanker, and bearing in mind, it was, by today's standards, it was a relatively small tanker, but this was the first time more than 100,000 tons of oil had been lost into the sea, and there just wasn't the facility around in either Britain or France or indeed anywhere in Europe to deal with such an enormous amount of oil let loose on the water.
First priority was to stop its entire cargo pouring out. But this was the first ever super spill, so no one knew how to control it.
Essentially, in the Torrey Canyon, the only technology that they tried to use to get rid of the oil on the surface of the sea was chemical dispersants. But many of the products they used were not really properly designed for that particular purpose. Therefore, they were very toxic. Some of them may have been efficient, but they probably did more damage to marine life and to the ecology than leaving the oil alone.
Something more spectacular was required. Britain's Royal Air Force was ordered to bomb the Torrey Canyon with napalm and high explosives. The aim was to release the remaining oil, which they would later set on fire. The plan was a fiasco. Many of the bombs missed, and when they did hit, the oil didn't burn easily. Most of it drifted away from the wreck and was washed up on the beach. After this disaster, marine safety groups vowed to be ready if it ever happened again. But they were totally unprepared for the scale of the next supertanker spill. In March 1978, the supertanker Anaco Cadiz split in two off the coast of Brittany. It spewed more than 200,000 tons of crude oil into the English Channel, fouling more than 70 miles of beautiful French coastline.
The Anaco Cadiz was certainly one of the very worst. It was certainly the biggest amount of oil that had actually been released into the sea at that time, other than from undersea oil wells and going berserk and things like that. The ship actually had a steering gear failure off the Brittany coast, and because the tug which was sent there wasn't powerful enough, the weather was unkind to them. Gradually and inexorably, this huge ship with 280,000 tons of crude oil on board just went up onto the beach and broke up.
Once beautiful villages turned into oil-saturated ghost towns. And once again, the hardest hit victims were the wildlife. But in 1989, the cleanup teams faced an even tougher challenge, controlling the 50-mile slick from spreading after the grounding of the US tanker, the Exxon Valdez, in the icy waters of Prince William Sound. This area was rich in marine wildlife, crucial to the livelihoods of local fishing communities. This string of disasters came to a climax one stormy January morning less than 4 years later, when the stricken tanker, the Brer, crashed against reefs off the Shetland Islands.
The ship lost power, and in the very severe weather at the time, I mean, winds were gusting force 11, force 12, the ship was blown towards the Shetland Isles.
The Shetlands are a group of islands off the northeast coast of Scotland. 6 miles offshore, the Brer lost power, started drifting, and ran aground off the west side of Garthness.
He broke down, but he broke down in a very vulnerable place, so he was extremely unlucky. If he'd broken down anywhere else, he'd have probably got away with it. But the engine decided to die on him just at that precise spot where the wind and the tide was going to throw him up onto the beach, and there was not a lot he was going to do about it.
The Brer lost her entire 84,700-ton cargo. The whole passage had been plagued by severe gales, which had broken several heavy pipes tack-welded to stop them rolling around. These then smashed into tanks that fed the main engines and crippled the ship just when she reached a narrow channel between the islands and the Scottish mainland. The immediate concern was whether the toxic fumes from the oil were dangerous.
Please clear the site immediately. There is a health hazard on the ship.
Everybody was taking precautions, including the RSPCA. They were on the scene almost immediately to check a nearby nature reserve. The Shetlands are home to many communities of British wildlife, some of whom were devastated by the disaster. Some survived, many did not. The area is also internationally important for its seabird colonies. After the Brer hit their seas, they didn't even have the strength to fly.
Two things happen to the birds. First of all, the oil ruins the waterproofing qualities of the plumage so that they become soaked and they can very quickly lose their body heat. That's the first thing. The second thing is they try to preen the oil off the plumage, and they eat the oil, they ingest it, and that immediately leads to stomach problems, kidney problems, liver problems, and they can die from those effects as well.
There may have been doubt about the oil's effect on humans, but there was no doubt at all about the effects on wildlife.
Over the course of the first month, about 1,500 dead birds were found along the beaches, and about another 200 birds were found alive but oiled, and they were taken to a rehabilitation centre to be cleaned up in hope that they could be released afterwards.
Many of the birds made desperate attempts to find safer ground, fleeing the oily seas to go inland to alien territory. The lucky ones had narrow escapes, wildlife rescue teams reaching them just in time. They would then be flown to Scotland for treatment, but the survival rate was just 1 in 10. The slick rapidly spread further and further up the coast and soon enveloped local fish farms. Thousands died, and a 400-square-mile no-fishing zone was immediately set up. The disaster effectively switched off the region's £35 million a year salmon farming industry. Contamination was so widespread that 2 harvests had to be destroyed, and many fishermen believed they would never be able to shake off the poisonous reputation thrust on them.
Apart from the pollution threat, which is quite real, we have the image. We might be branded. A lot of the farms are not going to be affected at all. That's the salmon farms. But the image might put us down.
The severe weather and pounding waves soon took their toll on the Brer. Gradually, she began breaking up, split into 3 sections within a week, and any remaining cargo gushed into the sea. Anti-pollution booms were brought in to try to contain the spread of the slick and gather the oil into a more manageable and defined area. Sea walls were quickly built to safeguard those waters still unpolluted. But the conditions at sea were far too rough to use the miles of booms stacking up redundant on quaysides. And specialist vessels brought in from Aberdeen were stranded at shore, unable to get out into the water. The next stage of the cleanup operation involved specially equipped Dakota aeroplanes. When oil reacts with water, it becomes difficult to control. It spreads quickly and can blanket several square miles within hours. So rather than having a point to pick up from, it's an ever-expanding obstacle.
You essentially have 2 major options. You either try to use floating barriers, booms, to corral the oil and to make it as thick as possible, to then put specialized skimmers into the oil to pick it up. So you try and restrict its spreading, you try and concentrate it, you try and pick it up to recover it. The other approach is, rather than trying to stop what is happening naturally, and that is the spreading and the breaking up of the oil, you speed up that process by adding chemical dispersants. And these are chemicals that break the oil up into very small droplets, help it to spread into the water column, to remove it from the surface, which is where most of the problems are caused, and therefore, if you like, get rid of the problem.
Once oil has washed up onto the coastline, it's dangerous to treat it with any chemicals. It's now up to primitive technology, and it's often simply a matter of physically wiping it off the rocks, scooping it up with a bucket and spade, and carrying it away. The total cost of the Brer cleanup operation was £2.5 million, but it could have been much worse. The pollution was quite small considering the quantity of oil lost. The vessel herself was completely dismembered. But the ferocious waves actually did some good when it came to limiting the damage.
The Brer was carrying a very light oil, a very light crude oil, which was very easily broken up by the severe weather at the time. By comparison, the Exxon Valdez was carrying a rather heavier oil, a thicker oil, and the weather conditions at the time were very still. And so there wasn't this natural force breaking the oil up into small droplets. Therefore, in the Exxon Valdez, the oil tended to spread a lot further on the surface, rather than getting broken up and dispersed into the water column.
Well, let's say that there several things conspired in Shetland to make this less of a disaster than it might have been. In the first place, it was a light crude oil called the Gulfax oil from the Norwegian oil fields. It was on its way to Canada. Second, the spill happened in hurricane-force winds, which persisted over days and spread the oil, dispersed it very rapidly. Thirdly, there were very high tides, and that helped to flux the oil in and out very quickly. And fourthly, the fact that it happened in winter meant that the wildlife vulnerability was somewhat lower than it would have been in the breeding season.
In fact, 18 months later, environmentalists discovered the Brer wreck had become colonized by the natural world. Seaweed and other marine organisms had grown, and an artificial reef created which had become a haven for fish. This time, man had been saved from himself. But one escape did not mean victory in the battle to contain the effects of leaking oil. Man still had to sharpen the weapon of technology. Despite their huge size, it was obvious that oil tankers needed to be stronger. From July 1993, all new British ships had to be built with a double-skinned hull. The vessel's cargo is contained in tanks within the inner hull. This is separated from the outer hull by a 2-meter wide cavity. So when the ship is pierced, none of the oil escapes.
That actually does work in the case of a very low-intensity collision or a low-intensity grounding, where you're not going too fast or where the rocks don't in fact penetrate the inner hull. It wouldn't have actually saved the Exxon Valdez, it certainly wouldn't have saved the Torrey Canyon, but there have been cases where it has worked.
The problem is that if you look at the catastrophic accidents like the Brer, like the Exxon Valdez to some extent, but certainly the Torrey Canyon, here you've got ships either running aground in severe weather or certainly hitting something with a severe amount of force. And really the construction of the tanker in that sort of respect is not irrelevant, but is less relevant. When taking the Brer, for example, whether the Brer had much thicker hulls or double hulls or triple hulls, really wouldn't make much difference when you've got a ship on the rocks in a force 11, force 12 gale.
But it would have saved the Sea Empress, grounded off Milford Haven in February 1996. Built before the new regulations, she only had a single hull. Other safety measures have also been scrutinized. The bridges of large vessels must be fitted with state-of-the-art navigational equipment to see other ships in bad weather. This radar equipment not only predicts where ships will go, but also gives a collision warning. Nevertheless, accidents continued. In June 1993, barely 5 months after the Brer grounding, the bulk carrier, the Western Winner, collided with BP's tanker, the British Trent, in the foggy English Channel. 9 of BP's crew perished. But the most damning evidence came in an inquiry by Lord Donaldson. He found that just a third of the ships visiting the UK in 1992 had been inspected, and most failed the safety standards.
About 120 of those revealed deficiencies which were so serious that they had to be detained. They were unseaworthy, and we would have been jeopardizing the lives of the crews if we'd allowed them to go to sea. Now, that is a quite appalling record. We don't know what the state of the other 4,000 was that we didn't inspect.
Lord Donaldson made 103 recommendations in his report. Amongst them, he stressed the need to map out environmental high-risk zones and reroute tankers away from heavily congested areas.
Most of the guidelines are obviously voluntary because in the end of the day, the master of a vessel needs to look first and foremost to the safety of his vessel. So it's very difficult to have mandatory measures that will stick in all conditions. But I think that what we need to find out more about is the degree of compliance with existing measures. Now, that requires a better knowledge of where the ships are. It requires radar studies and possibly putting transponders on vessels to find out where exactly they are at any particular time. We don't have sufficient knowledge at the moment of how vulnerable the sensitive areas are to tanker shipping, because we don't have enough knowledge of the shipping densities in certain areas.
One way of doing this is with transponders, a sophisticated radio identification system similar to air traffic control. Though this is not a new idea, it's still at the research and testing stage.
What the transponder system allows is for the Coast Guard stations to transmit a signal which the ships can recognize, and they will then automatically squawk back saying who they are and where they are. And if a ship is in difficulty, it gives a lot of basic information to the Coast Guard to make it easier for them to start a rescue operation.
But could such a system have saved the Brer before it was too late?
If this system had been fitted on the Brer, then the Coast Guard in the Shetlands would have had much more warning that the ship was out there, that it was in trouble, and that it was a tanker carrying a lot of oil. The problem of identifying ships has been a problem that's been addressed for many years now, and there's been various other accidents in the past in which identification of ships would have been a useful help.
Even so, transponders have only been fitted in a few British ships on a trial basis. Cheap to install, they're slowly being phased in over a 7-year period. The shipping community is making an effort to improve safety. Tankers are being built smaller, as charterers prefer more flexible ships that can enter ports more easily.
Ship owners recognize that they cannot operate oil tankers cheaply these days, because there is an enormous amount of inspection taking place. Wherever they go, people are inspecting the ships, they're testing the competence of the crews. Charterers, in other words, the people who hire the ships to carry their cargoes, they too are closely inspecting the ships, and they are not taking any risks with the cargoes they ship in tankers, so they are much fussier about the type of ship they operate.
Their efforts seem to be paying off. Statistics show that our seas are safer than ever. In 1974 and 75, there were 234 oil spills. In 1994 and 95, the figure had dropped to almost a quarter of that. Perhaps there are too many outmoded vessels sailing. One thing is clear. Ships carry 97% of all world trade, and we have no alternative.
Transport is an imprecise science to a certain extent. You're dealing with large movable objects in a hostile environment, and accidents do happen. The fact is, though, they do happen a good deal less than they did. There is far less oil being spilt into the sea today, even though there is more oil being carried at sea today. Ships don't bump into each other as much as they did because there is much more traffic routing around areas of dense traffic, like, for instance, the English Channel, the Singapore Straits, places like that. So There's a number of reasons why there are fewer accidents, and as I say, the results do speak for themselves, and there is far less oil going into the sea today than ever has been the case before.
I regretfully say I don't think there's any way that you can totally avoid an accident, whether it's to a ship or to a commercial aircraft or to cars driving on motorways or whatever else. It'd be very nice if we could live in an accident-free world. Sadly, whatever you do in terms of technical methods or training or improved navigational standards or whatever else, there are regrettably times when ships will come into very severe bad weather, where they may break down at the wrong time, where somebody may take a wrong decision, mistake a navigational aid or something, and with dramatic consequences.
Within days of recording this, his prediction came true. The Liberian-registered Sea Empress ran aground off Milford Haven, and nearly half of its cargo came gushing out. The area is important ecologically. It has many small islands, coves and bays that shelter rare breeds of wildlife. As the oil spread rapidly like a forest fire, it wiped out anything in its path. Once again, the salvage teams were helpless. But a groundbreaking device is being designed that may help solve the cleanup problem once and for all. The device, developed by an Anglo-Norwegian team, is called an oil spill recovery unit. Booms 35 meters long are fitted to the tanker's bow. The ship sails into the slick, channeling the mixture of oil and water through doors in the hull. As it flows down into the ship's tanks, the mixture is spun, separating the oil from the water. The clean water is then pumped back into the sea. The unit's inventors say one of these ships would take just 2 days to gobble up a 5-mile-long oil slick. The oil spill recovery unit could eliminate the as-yet unsolved problem of scooping up oil in rough waters. This would be crucial, particularly around Britain, where the seas are rough 80% of the time. But until this idea becomes practice, we have to rely on the skill and training of crews and the effectiveness of port authorities. So far, the technology has not been up to the task.
Once the oil hits the water, it spreads very rapidly and becomes out of control, and our technology, in comparison, is rather pathetic. So I think really, when they do happen, that is the problem, and the only solution to oil spills is to prevent them happening.
Og senere ble solgt og bygd om til cruisefart under navnet SS Norway. I denne franske dokumentaren blir vi med på et 4-dagers cruise i eventyrlige farvann i Karibia, og får samtidig høre historien til dette stolte skipet.